All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving headfirst into a story that's been going on for decades, China's attempts to regain control over Taiwan. And let me tell you, we've got some excerpts here from this historical analysis. It's called China and Taiwan, A History of Reunification Attempts. And wow, the persistence is just, it's incredible. It really makes you think, why have they been so determined? What have they tried? And how has Taiwan managed to hold on? Well, that is exactly what we're going to try to figure out today.
And it is so much more than just a history lesson. What's happening between China and Taiwan has serious global implications. It could have huge ripple effects all over the world.
Absolutely. It's a big deal. And to understand what's going on right now, we really need to rewind. Go back to 1949, the end of the Chinese Civil War. That's really where this whole story begins.
You've got the defeated nationalists, the Kuomintang, or KMT for short, fleeing to Taiwan and setting up the Republic of China, the ROC, and at the same time you have the communists, the CCP, winning on the mainland and forming the People's Republic of China, that's the PRC.
And that right there is the core issue. China is adamant that Taiwan is a breakaway province and that it must be reunified. But Taiwan has been operating as an independent country in everything but name for decades. So it's this really fundamental disagreement, this clash about Taiwan's status that has fueled all this tension.
Yeah, and then you add in the one China policy, which many countries, including the U.S., have adopted,
Yeah.
the diplomatic tightrope walk, acknowledging China's claim without necessarily saying they agree with it.
You could definitely say that the U.S. policy towards Taiwan is one of the trickiest to navigate. Officially, they recognize Beijing.
Yeah.
But then there's also the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically promises to provide Taiwan with the weapons it needs to defend itself. I mean, talk about mixed signals, right? How do you think that looks from China's perspective?
Well, it certainly doesn't help, let's put it that way. China sees any support for Taiwan, whether it's from the U.S. or any other country, as meddling in its internal affairs. I think it's important to really understand that for China, this isn't just about territory. It's about national pride. It's about historical grievances. It's about how they see themselves on the world stage and their rightful place in it.
Okay, so we've got the historical backdrop now.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what China actually did. Those early years after the Civil War, we're talking 1949 to the 1970s, that was a period of some pretty direct military action. We're talking about Mao Zedong and his goal to take Taiwan by force.
Yeah, it was a really dangerous game of chicken. Think about the first and second Taiwan Strait Crises. Those happened in the 1950s.
Yeah.
The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, they actually bombarded islands that were controlled by Taiwan.
And the U.S. didn't just sit back and watch, right?
Yeah.
They got involved, and that was a really early sign of their commitment to Taiwan's security. And who knows, it might have even prevented things from spiraling out of control.
Absolutely. The U.S. presence was a major deterrent. But there's another factor we have to consider. China's own capabilities at the time. Their Navy and their Air Force, they just weren't strong enough to pull off a successful invasion. Plus, on top of that, they ended up getting pulled into the Korean War, and that shifted their attention and their resources away from Taiwan.
So those early attempts at taking Taiwan by force, they didn't work out. But China being China, they weren't going to just give up. So in the 1970s, we see this shift in tactics, this change in their approach. Instead of outright force, they start to lean more on diplomacy, using international pressure to try and isolate Taiwan.
This is where that diplomatic war that we mentioned before really starts heating up. And a huge turning point came in 1971 when the UN actually voted to kick out the ROC, which represented Taiwan, and recognize the PRC as the only legitimate government of China. That was a massive setback for Taiwan. I mean, they lost their seat at the table.
And then just to add insult to injury, right on the heels of that, in 1979, the U.S. switched its diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. It's like a 1-2 punch. You lose your spot in the UN, and then your biggest ally formally recognizes your rival. Taiwan must have felt extremely isolated at that point.
It was definitely a very difficult period for Taiwan. There's no doubt about that. But I do want to make it clear that the U.S. didn't completely abandon Taiwan. Even as they were recognizing Beijing, they also passed the Taiwan Relations Act. And that act promised that the U.S. would continue to sell arms to Taiwan. It's such a tricky situation, this balancing act of trying to keep China happy while also supporting Taiwan.
It really does sound like a recipe for confusion, to be honest. But how did China react to all this?
They went all in on the one China policy. They started really putting the squeeze on other countries, trying to get them to cut ties with Taiwan. And they weren't afraid to use their growing economic power to get their way. They often offered economic incentives to sweeten the deal.
So it's almost like a business transaction, right? They're leveraging their economic clout to gain political influence.
Exactly. And it was surprisingly effective. Taiwan found itself excluded from a lot of international organizations,
Mm.
making it much harder for them to function on the world stage.
So let's recap. By the 1970s, China had tried direct military force. That didn't work. Then they tried a softer approach through diplomacy and international pressure. It seems like they were constantly adapting, constantly tweaking their strategy to try and get control over Taiwan. But what happened next? Did they stick with this diplomatic offensive, or did they come up with something completely new?
Well, things get really interesting at the end of the 20th century because Taiwan goes through a pretty major transformation. They become a democracy.
Hold on, you're saying that right when China is making some serious progress in isolating Taiwan, Taiwan decides to hold free elections. It seems like that would really throw a wrench in China's plans.
Oh, it definitely did. It was a huge curveball for them. And as Taiwan embraced democracy, the idea of independence started to gain traction. A lot more people in Taiwan started to think, hey, maybe we should just be our own country.
Yeah.
And of course, this was a huge red flag for China. They saw their goal of reunification slipping further and further away.
So how did China react to this? Did they try to undermine Taiwan's democracy?
They definitely tried to influence things, but they also fell back on some more familiar tactics. They started rattling their sabers again. Remember the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait Crisis? That's when China actually fired missiles near Taiwan, right before their very first democratic presidential election.
It's like they were sending a message, don't even think about going your own way.
Exactly. It was a very clear attempt to intimidate voters and disrupt the election, but it kind of backfired on them. The U.S. saw this as a serious threat, and they responded by sending 2 aircraft carriers to the region. It was a way of saying, we've got Taiwan's back, don't mess with them.
It's amazing how those aircraft carriers become these powerful symbols, almost like chess pieces, in this big geopolitical game.
They absolutely are. It's all about projecting power and sending a message. And in this case, the message was loud and clear. Don't even think about attacking Taiwan.
So China's show of force didn't quite have the effect they were hoping for. Did they try any other strategies during this time?
Well, they tried something a little different this time. They started pushing for closer economic ties with Taiwan. The idea was to create this web of interdependence, this feeling that the two economies were so intertwined that Taiwan would be more open to the idea of reunification.
It's sort of like, let's be best friends and then maybe you'll want to move in with me. But did it actually work?
This is where things get really interesting. It actually led to some pretty unintended consequences. While China did gain some leverage through these closer economic ties, Taiwanese investment in China actually ended up giving Taiwan more influence. It's like a two-way street. It created this mutual dependency, which complicated things for both sides.
So by the 2000s, China had tried military threats, they tried diplomatic isolation, and they even tried economic incentives. What's next in their playbook?
Well, the 21st century, particularly under Xi Jinping, brings a whole new level of intensity to China's efforts to gain control over Taiwan. It's like they took everything they learned from those previous decades, all the successes and failures, and they combined it into this much more aggressive, much more multifaceted strategy.
Okay, so things are about to get serious. What kind of changes did we see in China's approach?
Well, first, there's a massive military buildup. We're talking more ships, more planes, more missiles. And they're not just sitting around collecting dust. PLA Air Force jets are regularly entering Taiwan's airspace. And China's holding these large-scale military exercises that look a lot like rehearsals for an invasion.
Sounds like they're really turning up the heat, showing off their muscles, and trying to remind everyone who's in charge in that region.
You could definitely say that. But it's not just about raw military might anymore. They're also engaging in what's called hybrid warfare. That's a combination of cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and political maneuvering.
So it's like a digital and psychological offensive running parallel to their military buildup.
Exactly. They're using really sophisticated techniques to try to influence elections in Taiwan, to spread propaganda, and to basically sow discord and division within Taiwanese society.
And there have been a lot of reports about cyber attacks targeting Taiwan's government and critical infrastructure. It really highlights how warfare has changed. It's not just about tanks and bombs anymore.
Right. And then there's another factor that's weighing heavily on minds of the Taiwanese people, the situation in Hong Kong.
Oh, right. How could we forget about that? The crackdown on Hong Kong back in 2019 and 2020 really sent shockwaves through Taiwan.
You have to imagine what it was like for the Taiwanese people to watch what happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was promised autonomy and freedom, but those promises were broken.
It must have been a huge wake-up call for Taiwan. China's actions in Hong Kong basically shattered any trust that might have remained in Beijing's one country, two systems promises.
Exactly. The Hong Kong situation became this stark warning, this reminder of what could happen to Taiwan if they were to lose their autonomy.
It's a pretty sobering thought. And then, just when it seems like things can't get any more complex, the war in Ukraine breaks out. Did that have any impact on how China and Taiwan view each other?
Oh, it definitely did. It really ramped up the tension. I mean, the war in Ukraine has the whole world on edge, but for Taiwan, it's got to hit different, right? They're seeing this larger country invade a smaller neighbor, and it's got to be hard not to draw some comparisons there.
Absolutely. The Ukraine war has become this, cautionary tale,
Right.
And it's raised the stakes even higher for Taiwan, no question. And it's also sparked a pretty strong response from the U.S. and its allies. They're much more vocal now in their support for Taiwan, and they're providing more military aid as well. Yeah, it really feels like the whole world is watching this situation unfold. Everyone's wondering, is Taiwan going to be the next flashpoint? So let's talk about Taiwan's options here. How are they responding to all this pressure from China? Are they just sitting ducks, or are they actively trying to defend themselves?
And Taiwan is far from a sitting duck.
Hmm.
They've actually been pretty smart about how they're handling China. They know that a head-on military confrontation would be a disaster, so they've been focusing on making themselves a really, really tough target.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, for one, they've been pouring a ton of money into their military, particularly things like coastal defenses and mobile missile systems, things that would make an invasion really difficult. But they're also playing the long game.
Hmm.
You know, they're building strong relationships with other countries, especially democratic ones like the U.S., Japan, and Australia.
So it's like they're trying to build this network of allies, this coalition of support, hoping that strength in numbers will make China think twice before doing anything too crazy.
Exactly. It's all about showing China that attacking Taiwan wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be a quick victory. They would be up against a really determined opponent and one that has some powerful friends backing them up. And don't forget about the Taiwanese people themselves. They have shown time and time again that they're willing to fight for their democracy, for their way of life.
Yeah, that's a point that often gets lost in these discussions about geopolitics, We get
Yeah.
so caught up in the military hardware and the strategic maneuvering. But at the end of the day, it's the people who are going to be most affected by any conflict.
You're absolutely right. The people of Taiwan have built this vibrant, successful society, and they're not going to give it up without a fight.
So where do we go from here? What do you think is the most likely scenario for the future of Taiwan?
It's tough to say. It's such a complex situation. There are so many factors at play. I think the status quo, you know, Taiwan maintaining its independence in practice while China keeps the pressure on, that's probably going to continue for a while,
Hmm.
at least in the short term. But it's a very fragile situation. Things could change really quickly.
What kind of things could trigger a crisis?
Well, a change in leadership in either Beijing or Taipei could definitely shift the balance, or even a miscalculation, some kind of accident in the Taiwan Strait. That could escalate really quickly. And then there's always the risk that some big global event, like a conflict in another part of the world, could embolden China and make them more likely to take a more aggressive stance.
So you're saying that while an invasion might not be imminent, it's still a very real possibility, and we need to be prepared for that.
I think that's a fair assessment, yes. And it's not just a regional issue either. A conflict in the Taiwan Strait would have huge consequences for the entire world. It would disrupt trade, it would mess with supply chains, and it would definitely change the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region.
It's a good reminder that we live in a very interconnected world. What happens in one part of the globe can have ripple effects everywhere. So what can everyday people do? It feels like this is something that's controlled by governments and militaries, like it's way beyond our control.
You'd be surprised, actually. Just staying informed is a big help.
Yeah.
Understanding the complexities of this issue allows you to have better conversations about it,
Mhm.
and it allows you to advocate for policies that promote peace and stability.
So learning about this, it's not just for history buffs or political junkies. It's about being an informed citizen who can participate in shaping a better future.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that the choices we make as individuals, as businesses, as governments, they can have a real impact on how things unfold.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This has been a really eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've covered so much ground today, from the historical roots of this conflict all the way to the current geopolitical situation. And while the future of Taiwan is still very uncertain, one thing is for sure. This is a situation that deserves our attention. It deserves our understanding. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it informative and we hope it gave you something to think about.